The sun does not just shine, it hammers. It turns the sand into a furnace floor that sears through the soles of his feet with every heavy, dragging step. He stops, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that do little to cool his burning lungs. He lifts the water skin, his fingers trembling as he tilts it toward his parched lips. Nothing. He shakes it, once, twice, then harder, but the leather remains limp and hollow. The silence of the desert is absolute, broken only by the dry rasp of his own breathing. He lets the skin fall. It hits the cracked earth with a dull, pathetic thud, kicking up a tiny plume of dust that vanishes instantly in the heat haze. He does not reach down to retrieve it. He stands, motionless, his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon where the sky bleeds into the scorched ground. The path behind him is forgotten, and the path ahead offers nothing but the endless, mocking expanse of the dunes. A few paces away, a woman collapses onto a jagged rock. She does not look at the horizon. She buries her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the rhythm of quiet, jagged sobs. The man turns, his face a mask of tight, strained frustration. She lifts a hand, her finger trembling as she points back the way they came, toward the distant, invisible borders of Egypt. Her weeping intensifies, a sharp sound that cuts through the oppressive stillness of the dunes. They are free, yet they stand like prisoners within the walls of their own mounting anxiety.
They do not look back at the path they traveled, where the great sea once parted to let them pass. That miracle is a ghost, a memory, buried under the weight of the current heat. They remain frozen in the present, trapped by the fear of what they lack rather than the memory of what they were given. The woman points again, her arm rigid, her gaze fixed on the past, refusing to see the open road ahead. They are surrounded by the evidence of their survival, yet they act as if the desert is their permanent grave. The silence shattered. Their voices rose, thin and sharp, carried away by the relentless wind. The man gestured wildly at the empty sky, his fingers splayed as if trying to catch a sign that refused to manifest. His eyes were wide, burning with the heat of accusation. He did not look at the woman. He looked at the horizon, demanding an answer from the void. He began to pace in tight, frantic circles, his boots churning the sand into a fine, choking mist. With every turn, his shadow stretched long and jagged across the dunes, a dark, distorted reflection of his own internal chaos. He stopped abruptly, his chest heaving. He reached down, scooped a handful of grit, and watched it slip through his fingers. He was counting the days of his hunger, tallying the hours of his thirst, and measuring the distance between his current misery and his hope. He knelt and began to trace lines in the sand with a trembling finger. Each mark was a tally of his suffering, a deliberate record of his doubt. The grit of the desert floor dissolved into the polished surface of a desk. A woman sat in the artificial glow of a desk lamp, her gaze locked on a stack of unpaid bills. The paper edges were sharp, white, and demanding. She pushed the pile away with a sudden, jagged motion, her palms sliding against the wood. The room felt small, the air stagnant, devoid of the desert wind, but heavy with the same suffocating pressure. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen to type a message. Then she stopped. She deleted the draft, the screen going dark. She stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floor, and paced the narrow confines of the room. She stopped at the window, staring out at the city lights that flickered like dying embers in the distance. She did not see the city. She turned back to the desk, her eyes landing on a framed photograph. With a deliberate heavy hand, she turned the frame face down. She sat back down, the chair springs groaning under her weight. She pulled a notebook toward her, the paper crisp and blank. She picked up a pen, her grip tight, and began to write. Each line was a grievance, a tally of what she lacked, a record of every door that had closed. She wrote with force, the pen digging into the page, leaving deep, jagged indentations that mirrored the furrows in her brow. Every word she committed to the paper was a step further into her own private wilderness, a territory mapped by her own dissatisfaction. She did not look up. She did not pause. She filled the page until the ink smeared under her palm, a dark stain on her skin. She stopped, the pen hovering, and looked at the list. It was a map of her own making, a circle she had drawn around herself to keep the world at bay. Her hands curled inward, fingers digging into her own palms until the knuckles turned white. She held onto her fear, clutching it like a shield, unaware that her shield had become her cage. The image split down the center. On the left, the desert man stood frozen in the sand. On the right, the woman sat motionless in her office chair. Both stared at the ground. The man looked at the dry, cracked earth beneath his boots. The woman looked at the carpeted floor beneath her desk. Their postures mirrored each other, shoulders slumped, heads bowed in a heavy, unnatural silence. The wind whipped across the desert, lifting dust into the air, while the hum of the office air conditioner filled the room on the right. Neither moved, neither spoke. The man's hands hung limp at his sides, fingers slightly curled. The woman's hands rested on the notebook, her knuckles still white from the pressure of her grip. They were separated by thousands of years, yet they occupied the same mental space. They were both looking down, intentionally avoiding the horizon and the light. The camera held the frame, showing the man's shadow stretching across the dunes and the woman's shadow cast against the office wall. They were both trapped in the same cycle of forgetting. They remained still, two figures anchored to the earth, choosing the silence of their doubt over the memory of their deliverance. The man in the desert broke the silence first. He let his knees hit the sand with a heavy, dull thud that sent a small cloud of dust rising around his legs. He did not bow his head in prayer. He leaned forward, his weight shifting onto his palms, and pressed his fingers deep into the grit. He began to draw. He dragged his index finger through the surface, carving a long, jagged line into the earth. Then he drew another, parallel to the first. He moved with a slow, grinding rhythm, his eyes fixed only on the ground between his knees. Each mark was a tally, a physical record of another day spent in the heat, another day without the end he expected. He smoothed the sand over with his palm, erasing the previous lines, and started again. He was not looking for water. He was not looking for the path ahead. He was counting the duration of his wait, turning the delay into a permanent monument of his own making. He focused entirely on the texture of the sand, the resistance of the earth against his skin, and the repetitive motion of his hand. In the office, the woman mirrored his descent. She reached for the desk calendar, her fingers trembling as she gripped a heavy black pen. She pressed the tip against the paper, the ink bleeding into the fiber as she slashed a thick, jagged line through the current date. She did not stop. She moved to the next square, then the next, crossing out the days with a sharp, rhythmic scratching. The man in the sand continued his work, his fingernails caked with dust as he carved deeper grooves into the earth. He was not praying. He was tallying the hours of his perceived abandonment. The woman's hand moved with the same obsessive precision. She was trading the memory of her past stability for the cold, familiar comfort of her current misery. Both figures were now consumed by the act of measurement. The man smoothed the sand to start a new row of tallies, and the woman flipped the page to find more dates to destroy. They sat in their separate worlds, united by the ink and the dust, fully committed to the cycle of their own making. The man in the desert stopped his hand. The sun hung low, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the dunes like reaching fingers. He looked toward the horizon where the light still lingered, a thin golden line against the darkening sky. He did not rise. He simply shifted his weight, turning his shoulders away from the warmth. He pulled his knees toward his chest, curling into the cooling sand, and let his gaze drop back to the dust. In the office, the woman dropped the pen. It clattered against the desk, rolling until it hit the edge of the calendar. She looked toward the window, where the city lights hummed with distant, frantic energy. She did not reach for the latch. She reached for the lamp switch instead. With a sharp click, the room plunged into gray. She sat back, her silhouette blending into the deepening gloom. The desert light flickered, the sun dipping below the ridge, leaving the man in a sea of deepening violet. The office lights dimmed as the building's timer cut the power, leaving the woman in the quiet dark. Both figures remained motionless, their faces obscured by the absence of light. They were no longer counting days. They were simply waiting in the silence they had cultivated. The last sliver of brightness vanished from the sand. The final glow faded from the window. The screen went black, leaving only the sound of the wind and the heavy, absolute stillness of two people who had chosen the shadows over the dawn.